My brother scoffed, "Christmas isn't for failures, so don't bother coming." I smiled, quietly ended every dollar I'd been sending his family, then watched him desperately pound on my door begging me to change my mind. The problem was never really Christmas. The problem was that I had been keeping my brother's family afloat for so long that I had started to confuse that with being appreciated. By the time he said that to me, I had already been sending money every month for almost 3 years. Not gifts, not occasional help, real money. The kind that came from my paycheck before I paid myself anything nice. The kind that kept their lights on, their mortgage current, their kids in shoes that fit, and their fridge from looking empty at the end of the month. I told myself it was temporary when it started. That was the lie I used so I could sleep at night. My brother had gotten hurt at work, then laid off, then seemed to lose the ability to take any job that did not feel beneath him. I thought that was embarrassing enough without me making it worse, so I helped. At first it was a few $100 for groceries, then it was a utility bill, then it was a mortgage payment because the bank had started sending the kind of letters that make your stomach tighten before you even open them. Then it was school expenses, then it was gas, then it was winter clothes for the kids, then it was little emergencies that never felt little when someone was calling from the edge of panic. I am not rich, I am not even close. I work a boring, steady job. I live in a modest house. I drive an older truck. I clip coupons without feeling embarrassed about it. Every time I sent money, I had to decide whether I wanted to be generous or whether I wanted to keep pretending this would all sort itself out. I kept choosing generous. I kept choosing the version of myself that did not want to be the guy who left children to suffer because their father could not get his life together. That mattered to me. Still does. What changed was that I was the only one acting like it mattered. My brother had a wife and 2 kids. His wife worked part-time at first, then full-time when the house got tight. She was always polite to me, always grateful in a way that made me uncomfortable because it felt more real than anything my brother ever said. The kids were little enough that they did not understand the money part. They just knew Uncle was the guy who showed up with pizza, school supplies, and used gift cards that made Christmas look possible. I never made a big speech about any of it. I never wanted credit. I told myself that was the point. If I was doing it for praise, then I was doing it for the wrong reason. That sounded noble in my head. It also made me easier to use. I saw the signs. I just ignored them. The new truck tires, the fishing gear, the weekend trips that somehow still happened, when he was supposedly one missed paycheck away from disaster. The way he always had a story ready when something looked off. A refund, a work bonus, a borrowed favor, a gift from a friend, something, anything. I would notice, then I would remind myself that people under pressure do dumb things. I was not perfect either. I had enough to pay my bills and still help, so I did. That became my excuse for not asking enough questions. The trouble with being the responsible one in a family is that everyone gets comfortable treating your judgment like a public utility. They only notice when you shut it off. The first real crack in the whole thing happened around Thanksgiving. We all ended up at my mother's house because she still tried to keep the family together the way mothers do, even when the pieces have been chipped and glued too many times. My brother had been in a bad mood all day. He did that thing where he acted amused by everything and irritated by everyone. I had brought a pie, some beer, and gifts for the kids because I was trying to keep things light. I was not expecting anything from him. That was probably my mistake. He made a few comments that day about how some people build real lives and some people just drift through them. He kept looking at me when he said it. I let it go. I always let it go. I had spent years learning that there were some arguments you did not win in the moment. You just kept records, you kept receipts, you stayed calm. You watched what people did when they thought they had the upper hand. I did not know yet that the most important receipt would be the one he handed me himself. A little after dinner, when everybody was tired and half the dishes were already stacked near the sink, he cornered me in the kitchen. He had that smug look he got when he thought he was saying something clever. He told me in that contemptuous way of his that Christmas was not for failures and that I should not bother coming. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was saving me the embarrassment, like I was a charity case who had overstayed my welcome. I remember staring at him for a second longer than felt normal, not because I was shocked, because I was trying to understand where he thought he had gotten the right. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him back. I just nodded like I had heard him, finished loading the leftovers into a container, and left before I said something permanent. The drive home was colder than it should have been, or maybe I just noticed it more. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a while after I got home. The porch light made a weak yellow square on the snow. My house looked small and quiet in that way that usually comforted me. That night it just made me feel tired. I went inside. I put the leftovers away. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the calendar on the fridge. Christmas was still weeks away. I had already bought gifts. I had already planned to spend part of my holiday at my mother's house because I thought keeping the peace mattered. I thought being the bigger person was a good habit. I thought it made me stable. Instead, I suddenly felt stupid. Not hurt first, not even angry first. Just stupid. The kind of stupid that comes from realizing a whole pattern at once. I went to my desk and opened the folder where I kept all the transfers. I never stopped keeping records. That was one thing I had done right. Every Venmo transfer, every bank withdrawal, every cashier's check, every utility payment. Every time I had paid a bill directly because my brother said the account was messed up and he needed one more week. I had been thorough because money has a way of turning memory into fiction. The folder went back years. By midnight, I had my laptop open, a legal pad beside me, and a number circled in thick black ink that made my chest feel tight. I had sent more than I had realized, a lot more, enough that I could have fixed my own roof, enough that I could have paid down my truck, enough that I could have taken a real vacation for the first time in years. Instead, I had been helping my brother look like a man who had his life under control while he treated me like a disappointment. That was the part that made my face burn, not the money, the disrespect. I did not make any dramatic decisions that night. I did not call him. I did not text him. I did not write some angry speech that I knew I would regret later. I did what I always do when I am upset and want to stay useful. I went through everything twice. I checked dates. I matched transfers to bills. I looked at banknotes. I pulled old emails from the credit union where I had asked for higher limits on scheduled payments. A pattern started to show itself that I had somehow missed because I wanted to. The mortgage was paid almost always on the same day my transfer hit his wife's account. The utility bill got covered right after. The school account got paid right before field trips or lunch deficits. The groceries were the only thing I could not track cleanly because those were usually cash withdrawals or store gift cards. That was when I realized something else. I had not been helping through my brother. I had been helping around him. I had been helping his wife, his kids, and the parts of his life that still functioned despite him. That thought sat there a long time. It changed everything. I did not want to punish the children. That was never the goal. But I was done handing money to a man who thought my presence was optional. So I made a choice that felt cold at first and then oddly calm. I stopped every recurring transfer I had set up to his family. I canceled the automatic payment to the mortgage account I had been covering. I removed his wife from the linked cash app I used for emergency groceries. I ended the monthly deposits that had kept their utilities from slipping behind. I did it one by one carefully, the way you close windows in a house when a storm is coming. I did not send a warning. I did not want a fight. I wanted the facts to speak for themselves. 2 days later, I got my first sign that they had. It came in the form of a bank alert saying an external transfer had failed. I opened it expecting a technical glitch. Instead, it showed the mortgage payment had bounced back because the linked account no longer had enough behind it. I stared at the screen for a full minute. Then I called the bank. I had to confirm the cancellation, verify the payee, and make sure the auto draft was fully off. The woman on the phone sounded bored in the way bank employees do when they have heard every possible version of family disaster. She walked me through everything. I asked her if any other scheduled payments were still active. She checked and told me they were not. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there listening to the heat kick on in my house. I expected to feel guilty. What I felt first was relief. That surprised me. I thought relief meant I was selfish. It did not. It meant I had been carrying something too heavy for too long. I waited. The next morning, nothing happened. The morning after that, I got a text from my mother asking whether I had still planned to come for the Christmas Eve meal. I answered honestly and said I was not sure anymore. I did not tell her why. She and I have always been closer than she and my brother, but even she had a habit of smoothing things over instead of looking directly at the mess. Another day passed. Then my phone rang so many times from numbers I ignored that I stopped looking at the screen. Finally, my sister-in-law called from her own phone number, and I answered because I knew she would only reach out if something was wrong. That was the first real conversation I had after I cut everything off. Not because she was dramatic, because she was careful. She sounded tired, embarrassed, and scared in a way I had not heard before. She told me the mortgage company had called about the missing payment. She told me the electric company was warning about a delinquency. She told me the kids' after-school account had gone into negative territory because I had been paying it directly and the payment did not go through. She never once blamed me. That made it worse. She sounded like she had been holding her breath for years and had only just realized how close the floor was. I told her I would look at everything and call her back. I did not promise money. I did not say yes to anything. I hung up and sat in my kitchen until I was calm enough to think. Then I did something I should probably have done earlier. I started calling the institutions that had the actual records, the mortgage company, the utility provider, the school payment office, the county records office. I had no interest in snooping for the sake of drama. I wanted to know what was really happening. That is where the whole thing started changing shape. The mortgage company confirmed what I already suspected. The account had been getting paid by several different sources, not just my transfers. There had been cash contributions, checks from my brother, and occasional late fees that suggested the household was always just barely ahead of a bigger problem. The utility company said the same thing in a more polite way. The account had never been comfortably current. The school office confirmed that payments on the kids' accounts had come from different cards, some of them mine, some of them his wife's, and one or two that looked like they came from a third account tied to a local payment app. I asked for copies of what I was allowed to see. I was careful. I knew enough about other people's money to know that you do not just start throwing accusations around without documents. What I found next made me pause. The county records office had a lien notice on the property. Not a foreclosure yet, not a full disaster, but enough to tell me the house was being propped up by fragile accounting and the kind of hope that makes lenders nervous. The lien was not from the mortgage company. It was from a consumer debt, the sort of thing people usually hide until it becomes a problem they cannot outrun. I took the papers home and spread them across my table. It took me an hour to connect them. When I did, I felt that weird mix of embarrassment and anger that shows up when your confusion finally gets a shape. My brother had not just been short on money. He had been moving money around. He had been using my transfers to keep the family image intact while piling up other debts behind it. That was not a guess. The records showed it. There were payments to a place I did not recognize at first, which turned out to be a storage facility. There were smaller charges that became obvious once I looked closer. Online betting, fuel station cash advances, a tool store account, a truck accessory shop, a bar tab from somewhere I had never heard him mention. The whole thing was a mess of enough to be believable purchases, nothing flashy enough to look insane on its own, just enough to show a man who had been spending like he believed the future was someone else's problem. I sat with that for a long time, not because it was shocking, because it was exactly the kind of thing he would do while insisting he was the one carrying the family. I had one of those moments where everything you thought was a temporary rough patch starts looking like a character flaw you had been helping hide. The next evening, I went to my mother's house again, this time with copies of the records in a manila folder. I told myself I would stay calm. I told myself I would not let anyone talk me out of what I knew. My mother was in the kitchen when I got there. She looked worn out immediately, the way parents do when they can tell something bad has been circling the family for days. My brother was not there yet. His wife was. She looked like she had not slept properly in a week. The kids were upstairs, which was a blessing because I did not want them hearing any of it. I asked to sit down at the table, and once I did, I laid out everything in order. That is the part I remember most clearly, not the exact words, the order. I put the mortgage summary first, then the transfer history, then the late notices, then the lien, then the grocery and school payments, then the canceled automatic drafts, then the charges to the betting app and the storage unit. I watched my mother's face change as she went through them. I watched my sister-in-law start crying before she even got to the last page. I watched the room slowly come to the same conclusion I had already reached alone in my kitchen. My brother had been lying to everybody, not just about money, about who was keeping the family alive, about where the pressure really was, about who had been carrying what. He had let me look like the detached one, while I was the only person writing checks that prevented their world from collapsing. My sister-in-law admitted things I had not expected, not in a dramatic spill-everything way, more like the truth leaking out because there was no point protecting the lie anymore. She said he had been telling her the family was fine because I was helping. She said she had known the help existed, but not how much. She said she had started to think I was doing it because I pitied them. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. I told her that was never the reason. I said I helped because the kids were innocent and because I believed my brother would eventually get back on his feet. I did not mention that I also helped because I did not want to be the kind of man who turned his back. I already knew that made me predictable. Before I left, I asked her one question. I wanted to know whether she had seen the Christmas message from my brother. She had. She had not said much about it, but she looked ashamed that he had done it. That was enough for me. My mother did what mothers do. She tried to keep things from breaking wider than they already had. She asked whether there was any way to handle this privately. I told her there already had been for years. I told her I was done being the private solution to my brother's public disrespect. That was the first time I said it out loud. It sounded stronger than I felt, but it was true. My brother arrived while I was still there. I knew the truck's sound before I saw him. He came in carrying himself like he had already decided the situation was annoying because it involved him having to answer for something. He saw the folder on the table and understood immediately that he was no longer walking into a family conversation. He was walking into evidence. He started with irritation. Then he moved into disbelief. Then into the kind of offense that people use when they think being offended is the same thing as being right. I did not let him steer the room. I went through the records again. I showed him the dates of my transfers. I showed him the gaps after Christmas. I showed him the failed mortgage payment. I showed him the charges that made no sense if he was supposedly broke. I showed him the lien. I showed him the storage facility. I showed him the betting app withdrawals. He tried to wave away the truck shop charges by saying a man needed tools and tires to work. He tried to say the storage unit was for family stuff. He tried to say the betting app charges were a mistake or a friend's account or some nonsense that sounded thinner every second he spoke. I had learned something important by then. People like my brother rely on the speed of a conversation. They do not want you looking at the timeline. They want you reacting. So I did not react. I let the papers do their job. That is another thing I have learned the hard way. Calm is not the same as passive. Sometimes it is a weapon. By the time he realized I was not going to get loud, he got louder. He accused me of embarrassing him in front of his wife. He accused me of turning family into a courtroom. He accused me of making him look like a thief when all he had done was struggle. I remember staring at him and thinking that if he had just admitted he was overwhelmed, I might have believed him, but he could not even do that. He needed every problem to be somebody else's fault. He had spent so many years outsourcing responsibility that he no longer knew how to stand in the same room with it. My mother cried. My sister-in-law sat completely still. I watched my brother notice that no one was rescuing him from the facts and realized he was losing the only thing he had ever really controlled. The story he told about himself. He stormed out before the conversation ended, but not before he called me every version of selfish he could think of without sounding ridiculous. That was the last time I heard him when he still thought he had options. I went home that night not feeling victorious. Mostly I felt exhausted. There is a version of family conflict that feels dramatic while it is happening. This was not that. This felt like pulling a stuck drawer open and finding mold in the back. Disgusting. Preventable and somehow still your problem. For the next few days, nothing happened publicly. Then the consequences started arriving one by one. The mortgage company sent another notice. The utility account got a final warning. The school office called about the kids' lunch balance. The bank flagged the overdraft risk on the family account. The whole structure I had been quietly holding together began to show every weakness at once. That was when my brother showed up at my house. Not to apologize, not at first. He showed up because he needed money and did not know how to ask for it without sounding like a man who had already lost. I was in my living room when I heard the pounding on the front door. At first I thought it was someone delivering a package. Then it kept going. Harder, angrier, then desperate. I opened the door just enough to see him. His face was red from the cold. He looked like he had driven over in a hurry and had not thought about what he would say once he got there. He had not come to explain. He had come to pressure me. He asked, in a voice already halfway broken, why I had cut off the payments right before Christmas. He said the kids were scared. He said the mortgage company was calling. He said the water was in danger of being shut off. He said I could not do this to family. I stood there with my hand on the door and listened to all of it. I did not invite him in. I did not argue with the facts he was throwing at me. I told him I had stopped the money because he had made it clear I was not wanted. I told him I was done being useful only when he needed something. I told him I had the records and that every bill I had paid could be traced. I told him I knew about the hidden debts, the storage unit, and the betting charges. He tried to talk over me. I kept going anyway. I told him I was willing to help the kids, but not by handing him cash he would misuse and then blame me for withdrawing. That stopped him for a second. He was not used to hearing that, not from me, not from anybody. I had spent so long being the calm one that he had mistaken my patience for weakness. That is the mistake people like him make right before they lose control of the whole narrative. I told him help would no longer pass through his hands. If anything was going to be paid, it would go directly to the mortgage company or the utility provider. Not to him, not to his excuses, not to whatever middleman scheme he thought would save his pride. He started begging then, not dramatically, worse than that. He started talking like a man who had been caught in a collapse he had ignored for too long. He said he had a plan. He said things were about to turn around. He said he just needed time. I had heard all of that before, only with different dates attached to it. I said no, not angrily, just no. It was the first time he had ever seen me refuse him without apology. He did not handle it well. He shoved his hands through his hair and paced the porch like a trapped animal. He asked me how I could be so cold when children were involved. That was the sentence that almost made me laugh. Not because children were not involved, because he had spent years making sure they were involved in every crisis while acting like that somehow made him noble. I told him his wife and kids were the only reason I had helped this long. I told him he had made himself the obstacle. I told him I was willing to keep the house from falling apart for their sake, but only through direct payments and written terms. He stared at me like I had spoken another language. Then he got angry again and started saying I was trying to control him. I told him he had confused boundaries with control because he had never liked either one. He left after that, not gracefully. He drove away like a man who still believed the story would change if he just kept pushing. It did not. The next part took a week, then two. Then the truth started hitting the rest of the family, not through me but through paperwork. The mortgage company sent formal notices. The utility account changed status. The school office stopped being patient about the balance. My sister-in-law, who had been trying to protect everyone from the full picture, finally understood that she had been kept in the dark in the exact ways that made her vulnerable. She asked me to meet her at the bank. I went. I brought copies of everything. That meeting changed the direction of the whole mess. The banker confirmed there were enough late notices and payment irregularities that the family would need to restructure the account if they wanted to keep the house. He also confirmed that payments from me had been making the difference between barely current and seriously delinquent. That mattered because my brother had apparently been telling people I never did enough. He had made me sound stingy while leaning on me harder than anyone realized. My sister-in-law sat very still through all of it. Then she asked if I could help her set up direct payments so nothing went through him. I said yes. That was the moment I decided I was not going to let my anger harm the wrong people. I was done helping him. I was not done helping the kids. There is a difference. It took a little work to untangle the accounts. I had to talk to the mortgage company again. I had to confirm exactly what could be paid by a third party. I had to create a separate direct bill pay profile with my bank. I had to make sure every transfer was documented and routed in a way my brother could not manipulate. I had to make peace with the fact that I was now helping under stricter conditions than before because trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. I did not enjoy any of that, but I felt better doing it than I had felt handing over money blindly for years. My brother found out, of course. People like that always do. He was furious when he learned I had agreed to help directly through the bank and not through him. What he hated most was not the lack of money. It was the lack of control. He showed up again a few days later. This time he did not pound on the door for as long. He looked tired, really tired. Not the dramatic, tired people used to get sympathy. The kind that comes from a person finally seeing the shape of the hole he dug. He had with him a stack of papers from the mortgage company and the utility provider. He also had an envelope that looked like it had been opened and closed too many times. He asked if he could come in. I let him because I wanted to see whether he had finally brought anything honest with him. He sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in years, he did not try to act superior. He admitted, sort of, that he had been using the money to keep up appearances. He did not say he had been wasting it. He said he had been trying to hold the family together. That sounded better in his mouth than the evidence deserved. He talked about the truck, the side jobs, the debt, the pressure from people he owed. He talked around the word gambling the way a man circles a hole in the floor. He did not apologize cleanly. He did not fully confess. But he finally sounded like someone who understood that the bills were real and that I had not been imagining the scale of the problem. That was progress, I guess. It was not enough. I told him the payments would continue only to the mortgage and utilities directly, and only as long as his wife agreed to keep the accounts separate. I told him I would not cover his debts. I told him I would not rescue the truck. I told him I would not pay off the storage unit. I told him I would not be his emergency fund while he treated me like a punchline. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, but knew he had no ground left. That is the thing about records. They do not care how hurt you feel. They do not care how convincing your speech sounds. They do not care how often you say family. They just sit there and line up against the story. After that, things moved in a way that felt slower and more real than the original conflict. My sister-in-law started separating the finances. She got a new account in her own name. She met with the bank about the house. She spoke to the school about the kids' accounts. She made a list of monthly bills and income that actually existed instead of the ones my brother had been pretending existed. I helped where I could, not with cash in his hand, with systems, with paperwork, with direct payments, with reminders, with actual stability. That part mattered to me more than the drama did, because once the smoke cleared, I could see that the kids were the ones who had been suffering under all the noise. They were quieter around their father after that. Not scared exactly. Just aware. Children know more than adults like to admit. They know when the house feels unsafe, even if nobody raises a hand. They know when one parent has become a problem the other parent keeps calling temporary. Around that time, my mother finally stopped trying to mediate and started looking at my brother the way she probably should have years earlier. Not with hatred, with disappointment. There is a big difference. Hatred gives people a place to hide. Disappointment leaves them visible. That was hard for him, harder than yelling would have been. Christmas came anyway. Of course it did. The date never waits for family dysfunction to resolve itself. My brother did not host. My sister-in-law did not have the energy. My mother offered to have everyone over, but the house was too small for the emotional damage we were carrying, so I spent Christmas morning alone for the first time in a long time. I made coffee. I opened a few practical gifts from my mother. I called nobody before noon. Then my sister-in-law and the kids came by later with a couple of wrapped things they had picked out themselves. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to remind me that I had not disappeared from their lives when I stopped funding the illusion. We ate takeout at my table because nobody had the energy for anything else. It was one of the quietest Christmases I have ever had. It was also one of the best. I am not pretending that made the whole thing beautiful. It did not. My brother spent that day angry, humiliated, and broken the way a man becomes when he realizes he has built his adulthood on borrowed patience. He lost a lot more than money that month. He lost the ability to act entitled to help. He lost the luxury of speaking to me like I was lucky to be invited. He lost the version of himself that could sneer at me while I paid the bills behind the curtain. The consequences kept unfolding after the holidays. He had to sell the truck. He had to close the storage unit. He had to make an arrangement on one of the debts that turned out to be worse than he had admitted. My sister-in-law met with a lawyer to understand her options, and I went with her to one appointment because she asked, and because my brother had clearly been hiding too much for too long. Nothing about that process was dramatic in the movie sense. It was all forms, signatures, explanations, and embarrassment. That is real life. The part people do not show on television is how many ordinary rooms a disaster has to pass through before it becomes a resolution. Banks, offices, waiting rooms, the county records desk, a legal aid office where the chairs are uncomfortable, a kitchen table covered in printouts, a minivan full of kids asking whether the adults were mad because it was winter break. I learned a lot in those rooms. Mostly I learned that I had spent years feeling guilty for wanting my brother to behave like a decent person. That is not guilt I carry anymore. It took him a while to understand that the help was not going to vanish for the kids just because his pride got bruised. It also took him a while to understand that my willingness to help the family did not restore his right to insult me. That is where he kept getting stuck. He thought the money created obligation in both directions. It did not. Money I gave to keep children stable did not buy him the right to humiliate me. When that finally settled into him, he got quieter around me, not kinder. Just quieter, that was fine. I was never looking for a trophy apology. I wanted a stop to the nonsense. I wanted the truth to be visible. I wanted to know I had not spent years helping a liar without ever getting to say no. I got that. My mother eventually admitted she had noticed the pattern before I did, but had not wanted to believe it. That felt very on brand for our family. People see the smoke and hope it is from somebody else's fire. I did not blame her. I blamed myself a little for not seeing more earlier. That is another thing I learned. You can be generous and still be naive. You can be patient and still be used. The point is not to stop caring. The point is to stop confusing care with surrender. By spring, the practical side of everything had settled into something survivable. The mortgage was being paid directly. The utility account was stable again. The school accounts were current. My sister-in-law had a clearer picture of the finances than she had ever had. The kids looked less tense. My brother was still my brother, but he was no longer the man who could make demands and expect obedience. That was enough for me. He never fully recovered the old dynamic. I think that was the real punishment, if you can call it that, not the money. The loss of automatic trust. Once people start checking the numbers, manipulative stories do not age well. He learned that late. I learned something too. I learned that being the reliable one does not mean being the limitless one. I learned that generosity without boundaries becomes someone else's license. I learned that if a person can only treat you well when they need something, then they are not treating you well at all. The weirdest part is that I do not even think he saw himself as cruel. He probably still does not. I think he saw himself as cornered, embarrassed, and entitled to lash out at the person who made him feel small. That is how people justify a lot of ugly behavior. They tell themselves the other person made them do it. What he did not understand was that I had not been trying to make him feel small. I had been trying to keep his family steady. He turned that into a weakness and mocked me for it. That was his mistake. Because the second he did, I stopped being the only thing holding the whole mess together. I still help, but now it is on my terms, directly, openly, with records. The children are better for it. Their mother is better for it. I am definitely better for it. My brother is not happy about any of it, and I doubt he ever will be. That is not my problem anymore. The last time he came to my door, it was months later, and he did not pound on it. He stood there looking older than he should have and asked, in the roughest voice I have ever heard from him, whether there was any chance things could go back to how they were. I told him no. Not because I hate him, because how they were was the problem. He nodded like he understood even if he did not like it. Then he left. No scene, no shouting, no dramatic forgiveness, just a man finally walking away from a version of his life that depended on someone else never saying enough. I spent that next Christmas with my mother, my sister-in-law, and the kids. My brother came for part of it and behaved himself. That alone counted as progress. Nobody called anybody a failure. Nobody made jokes about who belonged and who did not. I brought dessert and a couple of practical gifts. The kids were happy. The house was warm. The bills were paid, and for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was attending my own life as a supporting character in someone else's bad choices. That old door-pounding memory still sticks with me sometimes, not because of the noise, because of the look on his face when he realized I was not going to save him from what he had built. That look was the moment everything changed. Not when I got angry, not when I made a speech, not when I exposed the records. It changed when I calmly stopped paying for a lie. That turned out to be the strongest thing I could do, and honestly, it was enough.